It's sad that I have to walk around, terrified for my life and my children's. I know if something happens to me, please know who did it. This man has said numerous times that he's going to kill me. I am posting and trying to leave a paper trail." These weren't the words of a fictional character in a thriller movie. These were the desperate, haunting words typed by 34-year-old Crystal Evans on her Facebook page in September of 2021. A Georgia mother of multiple children, frantically documenting her fears in the only way she knew how, through social media posts that would later become evidence in a murder case. Crystal wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't seeking attention. She was literally fighting for her life, using Facebook as her lifeline, hoping someone would listen, someone would help, someone would save her from the man she once loved. The man who had promised to cherish and protect her had become her greatest threat. Her posts painted a terrifying picture of a woman trapped, desperate, and running out of options. Each status update was a cry for help, each comment a plea for intervention. Little did she know that her digital documentation would become the key evidence in understanding exactly what led to her brutal murder just days later. September 13th, 2021 started like any other court day at the Spalding County Courthouse in Griffin, Georgia. Crystal Evans walked through those courthouse doors knowing this could be a turning point in her life. She was there for two critical hearings: her divorce proceedings from Tom Mallory, her husband of over 2 decades, and his pending forgery charges. Just 2 days earlier, on September 11th, Crystal had finally been granted the protective order she desperately needed against Tom. The legal document was supposed to keep him away from her, but Crystal's family knew better. They understood that a piece of paper couldn't stop a man who had repeatedly threatened to kill his wife. As the hearings concluded that afternoon, a family friend made a simple request to courthouse officials: please escort Crystal to her car. The request seemed reasonable given the circumstances, given the threats, given the protective order that had just been issued. But that request was ignored. Crystal walked out of that courthouse alone, heading toward her vehicle in the parking lot, completely unprotected. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something important. How many of you have seen warning signs like Crystal's on social media? Maybe a friend posting about relationship troubles, or someone you know documenting threats against them. Here's the reality. Social media has become the modern-day diary for people in crisis, and we're often the only witnesses to their pain. If this story is already giving you goosebumps, hit that subscribe button right now, because we dive deep into cases like this every week. And I want you to comment below. Have you ever seen someone use social media to document their fears? Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Crystal Evans wasn't just another statistic in domestic violence cases. She was a vibrant Georgia native who had spent her entire adult life building what she thought was a loving family. Friends and neighbors described her as energetic, kind-hearted, and fiercely devoted to her children. She was the type of mother who never missed a school event, who made sure her kids felt loved and supported no matter what chaos was happening in her marriage. Crystal and Tom Mallory had known each other since childhood, their relationship spanning more than 20 years. What started as young love had grown into marriage and parenthood, but somewhere along the way, that love had transformed into something dangerous. Despite the mounting problems in her relationship, Crystal remained focused on one thing: protecting her children and providing them with stability. She was a woman who believed in doing the right thing, following proper channels, and trusting the system to protect her. That trust would ultimately cost her everything. In small-town Georgia, some love stories begin in elementary school code playgrounds and stretch across decades. Crystal and Tom Mallory were one of those couples that everyone thought was destined to be together forever. They met as children, grew up in the same community, and watched each other transform from kids into teenagers, then into young adults. Their relationship had the kind of foundation that fairy tales are built on: shared memories, mutual friends, and families who had known each other for years. Tom was charming, well-liked in their community, and seemed genuinely devoted to Crystal during their early years together. Friends would often comment on how sweet they were together, how they seemed to complete each other. As they entered their 20s, marriage felt like the natural next step. Everyone expected it, everyone celebrated it, and everyone believed they were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful life together. Tom appeared to be the kind of man any woman would want, attentive, caring, and committed to building a future with the girl he'd loved since childhood. But appearances can be deceiving, and the Tom Mallory that Crystal fell in love with as a child would prove to be very different from the man she would eventually fear for her life. Marriage brought new dreams and possibilities for Crystal and Tom. They settled into married life with the enthusiasm of young couples who believe they can conquer anything together. Soon, children began arriving, and Crystal threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her life. Crystal was the kind of mother who made homemade lunches, attended every school function, and created traditions that her children would remember forever. She balanced work and family life while maintaining an active presence in their Georgia community. Neighbors knew her as the woman who would help with fundraisers, volunteer for school events, and always had a kind word for everyone she met. From the outside, the Mallory family looked like they had it all figured out. Tom worked steadily. Crystal managed the household and children with grace, and their social media posts showed family vacations, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. They appeared to be living the American dream, a couple who had grown up together, married their childhood sweetheart, and built a beautiful family. But behind closed doors, a different reality was taking shape. The pressures of marriage, parenthood, and adult responsibilities began to reveal aspects of Tom's personality that Crystal had never seen during their younger years. The first signs of trouble weren't dramatic or obvious. They started as small arguments that lasted longer than they should have, moments when Tom's temper flared over minor issues, and instances where Crystal found herself walking on eggshells to avoid conflict. What had once been playful disagreements between childhood sweethearts gradually transformed into something more concerning. Friends and family members began noticing changes in their dynamic. Tom became more controlling, questioning Crystal's decisions and isolating her from some of her support systems. The man who had once been charming and attentive started showing possessive behaviors that made those closest to Crystal uncomfortable.
There are calls for justice after a woman was shot and killed outside the Spalding County Courthouse. Crystal Evans and her ex-husband, Tom Mallory, were at the courthouse Friday afternoon. They were there for a hearing when Mallory allegedly shot Evans a number of times, killing her. Investigators say he ran from police and eventually shot himself, but he survived. Now we're learning more from Crystal's daughter, who says her mother had a restraining order against her father. Griffin police confirm the couple had a history of domestic violence.
My mom literally called the sheriff department the day before because he was stalking her. She even showed them that the PTO that she was granted for life Wednesday from the divorce, and they did nothing. Had they had someone walked out with her, like, her friend asked, she would still be here.
Griffin police deny that Evans asked for an escort. Precious says she will hold a rally for justice Wednesday and a vigil for her mother on Thursday.
Crystal, ever the optimist and devoted wife, initially attributed these changes to stress from work, financial pressures, or the normal challenges that come with raising a family. She believed that with patience and love, they could work through whatever was causing the tension in their marriage. She had invested too much of her life in this relationship to give up without fighting for it. By 2021, the marriage that had once seemed unbreakable was falling apart rapidly. Tom's behavior had escalated from controlling to threatening, and Crystal could no longer ignore the danger she was facing. The verbal arguments had become more intense, and Tom's threats against her life were becoming frequent and specific. Crystal made the difficult decision to file for divorce, a choice that seemed to trigger even more violent behavior from Tom. What had started as emotional abuse was now crossing into territory that terrified her. She realized that the man she had loved for over 20 years had become someone she no longer recognized, someone capable of carrying out the threats he was making against her life. When traditional support systems fail, desperate people turn to whatever platform they can find to cry for help. For Crystal Evans, that platform became Facebook. In the weeks leading up to her death, her social media posts transformed from typical family updates and community news into something far more urgent, a digital diary of terror. This man has said numerous times that he's going to kill me, she wrote in one post that would later become crucial evidence. These weren't vague complaints about marital problems or requests for relationship advice. These were specific, detailed accounts of a woman who genuinely believed her life was in immediate danger. Crystal's Facebook timeline became a real-time documentation of escalating domestic violence. She posted about walking around terrified, about fearing for her children's safety, and about Tom's repeated death threats. Each post was more desperate than the last, painting a picture of a woman who was running out of options and running out of time. Her friends and family members who saw these posts were alarmed, but many didn't fully grasp the severity of the situation. Social media has a way of making everything seem less real, more dramatic than it actually is. But Crystal wasn't being dramatic. She was literally documenting what she believed would be evidence of her own murder. The comments on her posts ranged from supportive messages to advice about calling police. But what Crystal needed was immediate, physical protection that social media couldn't provide. What made Crystal's social media posts particularly heartbreaking was how calculated and strategic they were. This wasn't a woman having an emotional breakdown online. This was someone who understood that she might not survive what was happening to her, and she was determined to leave evidence behind. "I am posting and trying to leave a paper trail," she wrote explicitly in one of her most haunting posts. Crystal knew that if something happened to her, these Facebook posts might be the only way to tell her story. She was creating a digital record that could potentially help investigators understand exactly who was responsible for her death. Her posts included specific details about Tom's threats, dates when incidents occurred, and clear statements about her fear for her life. She wasn't just venting frustration about a difficult marriage. She was building a case, documenting abuse, and ensuring that if the worst happened, there would be evidence pointing directly to her killer. The tragic irony is that Crystal was essentially writing her own obituary in real time, creating the very evidence that would later be used to understand the circumstances of her murder. She had become both the victim and the detective in her own case, desperately trying to protect herself through documentation when physical protection seemed impossible to obtain. Despite her detailed documentation and clear statements about fearing for her life, Crystal struggled to get the protection she desperately needed from law enforcement. She had done everything right. She had reported the threats. She had documented the abuse, and she was actively seeking legal remedies through the court system. But the reality of domestic violence protection is far more complicated than simply calling police or filing reports. Crystal's family members had repeatedly advocated for increased security measures, especially during court appearances where she would be vulnerable. They understood that Tom's threats were escalating and that a protective order alone wouldn't be enough to keep her safe. The system that was supposed to protect her seemed overwhelmed, understaffed, or simply unable to provide the level of security that her situation required. Despite having a clear paper trail of threats and a protective order in place, Crystal remained essentially unprotected during the most dangerous moments of her legal proceedings against Tom. I want you to pause for a moment and think about this. How many times have you scrolled past someone's social media post about relationship problems and kept moving? Crystal's story shows us that sometimes those posts aren't just drama. They're literal cries for help from someone who might not survive the week. Comment below and tell me, have you ever seen warning signs like Crystal's on social media? And more importantly, did you take action or just keep scrolling? Your answers might help someone else recognize when a friend or family member is in real danger. Don't forget to share this video because awareness saves lives. September 11th, 2021 should have been a day of relief for Crystal Evans. After weeks of documented threats, social media pleas, and escalating fear, she finally received what she had been desperately seeking: a protective order against Tom Mallory. The legal document officially recognized what Crystal had been trying to tell everyone. She was in danger. The protective order contained all the standard provisions designed to keep abusers away from their victims. Tom was legally prohibited from contacting Crystal, coming near her home, or approaching her workplace. On paper, it looked comprehensive and protective. The court had acknowledged the validity of her fears and taken official action to safeguard her life. For many domestic violence victims, obtaining a protective order represents a turning point. the moment when the legal system finally steps in to provide the protection they need. Crystal had followed all the proper procedures, provided documentation of the threats, and successfully navigated the legal process to secure this protection. But Crystal's family knew something that the court system seemed to overlook. A piece of paper cannot stop a bullet. While the protective order might deter some abusers, Tom Mallory had already demonstrated that he was beyond the point where legal consequences would influence his behavior. The protective order gave Crystal's family a false sense of hope, but those closest to her remained deeply concerned about her safety. They understood that Tom's threats had escalated beyond the point where a legal document would make any difference. His behavior suggested someone who was no longer thinking rationally about consequences or legal repercussions. Crystal's daughter, Precious Evans, and other family members continued to worry about specific situations where Crystal would be vulnerable. The family's fears weren't unfounded paranoia. They were based on their intimate knowledge of Tom's escalating behavior and his specific threats against Crystal's life. While the protective order might provide some legal recourse after a violation occurred, it offered no physical protection during the moments when Crystal would be most at risk. The upcoming court date on September 13th created exactly the scenario that Crystal's family had been dreading. Despite the protective order, both Crystal and Tom would be required to appear at the Spalding County Courthouse for hearings related to their divorce proceedings and Tom's pending forgery charges. This meant they would be in the same building, potentially at the same time, creating a dangerous situation. Understanding the risks involved, Crystal's family and friends began advocating for additional security measures during the court appearance. They weren't asking for anything extraordinary, just basic precautions that would ensure Crystal's safety during the most vulnerable moments of the legal process. Their primary concern was the transition from the courthouse to the parking lot, where Crystal would be alone and exposed. A family friend specifically requested that courthouse officials provide an escort for Crystal from the building to her vehicle after the hearings concluded. This seemed like a reasonable request, given the documented threats, the recent protective order, and the high-risk nature of the situation. The request was simple, practical, and could have been easily implemented with minimal resources. However, courthouse officials allegedly dismissed or ignored this request for protection. The very system that had issued the protective order failed to provide the basic security measures that could have prevented what happened next. September 13th, 2021 began with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies life-changing court appearances. Crystal Evans arrived at the Spalding County Courthouse, knowing that this day would determine the future of her marriage, her safety, and her children's well-being. She was there for two separate but related legal matters that had consumed her life for months. The first hearing involved the divorce proceedings that would officially end her marriage to Tom Mallory. After more than 20 years together, their relationship had deteriorated to the point where legal intervention was the only path forward. The divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about Crystal's attempt to legally separate herself from a man who had repeatedly threatened to kill her. The second hearing concerned Tom's pending forgery charges, a criminal matter that added another layer of complexity to their already volatile situation. These charges suggested that Tom's behavior had extended beyond domestic threats into other areas of criminal activity, painting a picture of someone whose life was falling apart in multiple ways. Both hearings proceeded as scheduled, with lawyers presenting their cases and the court addressing the various legal issues. From a procedural standpoint, everything appeared to go smoothly. The legal system was functioning exactly as it was designed to function, but it was completely unprepared for what Tom Mallory was planning to do next. As the court hearings concluded that afternoon, Crystal's family friend approached courthouse officials with a request that seemed both reasonable and urgent. Given the documented threats against Crystal's life, the recent protective order, and the high-risk nature of the situation, they asked for something simple. Please escort Crystal safely to her vehicle in the parking lot. This wasn't an unusual request in domestic violence cases. Courts across the country routinely provide security escorts for victims who face credible threats from their abusers. The request required minimal resources, just having a security officer or deputy walk with Crystal from the courthouse door to her car. It was a basic safety measure that could have been implemented in minutes. But according to Crystal's family, courthouse officials dismissed or ignored this plea for protection. Whether due to staffing limitations, procedural restrictions, or simple oversight, the request was not granted. The very institution that had issued Crystal's protective order just 2 days earlier failed to provide the practical protection she needed during her most vulnerable moment. This decision would prove to be fatal. The few minutes it would have taken to escort Crystal to her car could have saved her life. Instead, she was left to navigate the most dangerous part of her day completely alone, exactly when Tom Mallory was waiting for his opportunity. Crystal Evans walked out of the Spalding County Courthouse that afternoon, believing the hardest part of her day was over. The legal proceedings had concluded, and she was finally heading home to her children. She made her way across the parking lot toward her vehicle, probably thinking about dinner plans, homework help, and the normal evening routine that awaited her. She had no way of knowing that Tom Mallory was watching her every move. Despite the protective order that legally prohibited him from approaching her, he had positioned himself where he could observe her exit from the courthouse. As Crystal reached her car and began to unlock it, Tom emerged from wherever he had been hiding and approached her. What happened next lasted only seconds, but would destroy multiple families forever. Tom Mallory pulled out a gun and shot Crystal Evans 5 times in that courthouse parking lot. The woman who had spent weeks documenting her fears on social media, who had obtained a protective order, who had done everything the system told her to do, was murdered in broad daylight, just steps away from the building where she had sought justice. The shots rang out in the afternoon air, shattering the quiet of what should have been a routine court day. Crystal collapsed beside her vehicle, her life ending in the exact way she had predicted and feared. Her Facebook posts had been prophetic. She had known exactly who would kill her, and she had been powerless to stop it despite following every legal avenue available to her. After shooting Crystal 5 times, Tom Mallory fled the courthouse parking lot, leaving his wife of over 20 years dying beside her car. Law enforcement officers who responded to the shooting immediately launched a pursuit, understanding that they were dealing with a man who had just committed murder in broad daylight and had nothing left to lose. The chase didn't last long. Tom knew that his life as he had known it was over, and he had apparently planned for this moment. During the pursuit, he turned the gun on himself, shooting himself in the head in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. The same weapon he had used to end Crystal's life was now pointed at his own. However, Tom's suicide attempt was unsuccessful. Despite the severity of his self-inflicted wound, he survived and was expected to recover. While Crystal lay dead in the courthouse parking lot, the man who had killed her would live to face the consequences of his actions in court. The Spalding County Sheriff's Office responded swiftly to the courthouse shooting, securing the crime scene and beginning the investigation into Crystal Evans's murder. Deputies cordoned off the parking lot, collected evidence, and began interviewing witnesses who had seen or heard the shooting. The investigation was straightforward in terms of identifying the perpetrator. Tom Mallory had committed the murder in broad daylight with multiple potential witnesses. What made this case particularly compelling for investigators was the extensive digital evidence that Crystal had created in the weeks leading up to her death. Her Facebook posts provided a detailed timeline of escalating threats and documented fears, creating a clear motive and establishing a pattern of domestic violence that had culminated in murder. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with Crystal's social media documentation, painted a complete picture of premeditated domestic violence homicide. Investigators had rarely seen a case where the victim had so thoroughly documented the circumstances that would lead to their own death, making Crystal's murder both tragic and unusually well documented from a legal perspective. News of Crystal Evans's murder spread quickly through the Georgia community and beyond, sparking immediate outrage and demands for accountability. The fact that she had been killed just steps away from the courthouse, despite having a protective order and documented threats, highlighted serious failures in the system designed to protect domestic violence victims. Community members organized vigils and support networks for Crystal's family, but their grief was mixed with anger at the preventable nature of her death. Social media platforms filled with posts questioning how a woman who had done everything right, documented the abuse, sought legal protection, and followed proper procedures, could still end up murdered in a courthouse parking lot. Local advocacy groups seized on Crystal's case as an example of systemic failures that put domestic violence victims at risk. They pointed to the ignored request for a security escort as evidence that protective orders are meaningless without practical enforcement and safety measures. The case became a rallying point for discussions about courthouse security, law enforcement training, and the responsibilities of the justice system. Sheriff Darrell Dix found himself addressing public criticism about his department's handling of the case. He acknowledged the limitations of current laws and the challenges of providing adequate protection to domestic violence victims, but his explanations did little to satisfy a community that believed Crystal's death could have been prevented. In the wake of her mother's murder, Precious Evans transformed her grief into advocacy, becoming a powerful voice for domestic violence victims and systemic reform. She refused to let her mother's death be just another statistic, instead using Crystal's story to highlight the failures that had cost her mother's life. Precious spoke publicly about the family's repeated requests for protection that had been ignored, the inadequate response from courthouse officials, and the systemic problems that allowed her mother to be murdered despite following all proper legal procedures. Her advocacy extended beyond seeking justice for her mother to pushing for changes that could prevent similar tragedies. The family's fight wasn't just about holding Tom Mallory accountable for the murder. It was about holding the system accountable for its failures. They demanded answers about why their requests for security had been dismissed and pushed for policy changes that would better protect future victims. Precious Evans had inherited her mother's determination, channeling it into a mission to ensure that Crystal's death would lead to meaningful change. Crystal Evans' story teaches us that escalating domestic violence follows predictable patterns that we must learn to recognize. When someone starts documenting threats on social media, posting about fearing for their life, or explicitly stating that they know who will kill them, these aren't cries for attention. They're emergency signals that require immediate intervention. The warning signs include isolation from friends and family, controlling behavior from partners, threats that become more specific and frequent, and victims who start creating digital paper trails of abuse. If you see someone posting like Crystal did, don't scroll past. Reach out, offer support, and help them connect with professional resources. Social media posts about relationship fears should always be taken seriously, especially when they include specific threats or mentions of weapons. If this story opened your eyes to the reality of domestic violence, please subscribe to Explosive True Crime Stories and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Crystal's story. Your engagement helps us reach more people who might recognize these warning signs in their own lives. You can help prevent tragedies like Crystal's by taking social media warnings seriously, supporting local domestic violence organizations, and advocating for better courthouse security measures. If someone you know is documenting threats online, help them create safety plans and connect with professional advocates who can provide real protection.